Hey family, take a breath with me for a moment, because what we are about to talk about is not gossip. It's not noise. It's not clicks. This is about legacy. It's about accountability. And it's about what happens when power finally runs out. Now listen carefully. There comes a moment in every powerful man's life when the room stops responding to him. When the applause dries up. When the chants fall flat. When the magic, whatever it once was, no longer works. And when that moment comes, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't scream. It doesn't argue. It arrives quietly. It arrives as silence. And that silence, that silence tells you everything you need to know. Because what we just witnessed on that stage wasn't a bad performance. It wasn't nerves. It wasn't a technical issue. It wasn't the crowd being tired or distracted. It was rejection. Public, undeniable rejection. Diddy's son, standing on a stage built by his father's legacy, tried to call a chant that once ruled the culture. A chant that used to shake arenas. A chant that once meant power, access, fear, money, and control. When I say bad, y'all say boy. And the crowd did nothing. No roar. No energy. No love. No respect. Just a few scattered voices trying to carry something that no longer has weight. That moment right there was not about the son. It was about the father. It was about the name. It was about the stain. It was about a public that has decided, without a press release, without a verdict, without permission, that they are done. That silence was the verdict. And for those of us who've lived long enough to see empires rise and fall, we know what that means. We've seen it before. We've watched powerful men lose rooms. We've watched legends become liabilities. We've watched once untouchable figures suddenly find themselves standing alone, wondering where everybody went. This was not humiliation for entertainment. This was consequence. Because bad boy wasn't just a label. It was an era. It was a feeling. It was a movement. It was a moment in American culture when music felt dangerous and exciting and new. For many of us, it soundtracked our lives, our youth, our memories. But legacies don't survive on nostalgia alone. They survive on character. And when character collapses, no amount of branding can save it. Now understand this. That stage was sacred ground. That was bad boy territory. That was supposed to be home field advantage. If there was ever a place where the chant should have worked, it was right there. And it didn't. That tells us something important. The public didn't forget. The public didn't misunderstand. The public didn't wait for more information. The public decided. And when people decide in silence, that's the hardest decision to reverse. Because boos can fade. Arguments can be spun. Controversy can be managed. But indifference? That's fatal. That silence wasn't loud because it didn't need to be. It carried decades of disappointment. It carried exhaustion. It carried the weight of stories people didn't want to believe, but could no longer ignore. And here's the part that hurts the most. That silence traveled all the way back to a jail cell. Because make no mistake, this humiliation didn't stop at the stage. It echoed. It landed. It reached the man who built the empire. And that's the part people don't want to say out loud. This wasn't just a bad moment for a son trying to uphold a family legacy. This was the public saying, we don't believe anymore. Not the image. Not the story. Not the redemption arc. Not the comeback. And at a certain age, especially for those of us who have lived long enough to know better, we understand this truth. When belief is gone, there is no strategy that can bring it back. Only accountability can. And that's where this story truly begins. Because while one silence was happening on a stage, another voice was speaking somewhere else. Calm, clear, unafraid. Charlemagne. And what he said, what he dared to say, was something the industry has been avoiding for decades. He said the quiet part out loud. And once the quiet part is spoken, there's no going back. There is a certain age where you stop being impressed by noise. You've heard it all before. The promises. The apologies that aren't really apologies. The public tears that dry up as soon as the cameras turn off. And that's why what Charlemagne said mattered. Not because he's loud. Not because he's controversial. But because he spoke with the calm of someone who understands how power really works. And how it disappears. When he sat with Angie Martinez and said, plainly, that Diddy has shown no accountability, no growth, no true reflection, it landed differently. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't internet chatter. It was a man from inside the system acknowledging something the public has already felt in its bones. That the man has not changed. And for people who've lived long lives, who've watched leaders fall, pastors collapse, politicians unravel, we know something very important. Change doesn't come from time passing. Change comes from humility. And humility is the one thing power never teaches. Charlemagne wasn't speaking as an enemy. He wasn't piling on. He wasn't chasing a headline. He was speaking as someone who understands the moral responsibility of a microphone. He said what so many people in the industry whisper behind closed doors, but are too afraid to say publicly. If someone was dangerous before accountability, they are still dangerous without it. That truth hits harder when you've lived long enough to see how many people get hurt while waiting for a powerful man to come around. And that's the part that makes this conversation uncomfortable. Because for years, decades even, people were protected by silence. People were shielded by loyalty. People were excused because they were profitable, because they were influential, because they controlled access. That's how gatekeeping works. You don't need to threaten people. You just need to be useful to them. And Diddy was very useful to a lot of people for a very long time. He made careers. He opened doors. He wrote checks. He decided who got in and who stayed out. And when someone controls opportunity, people stop asking questions. They stop pushing. They stop investigating. They stop caring about the truth. That's not journalism. That's dependency. And for years, the mainstream media played that role. Not because they didn't know, but because knowing didn't benefit them. When the first allegations came out, the response wasn't curiosity. It wasn't concern. It was dismissal, minimization, silence. People forget that. They forget how long it took before anyone with a reputable platform was willing to touch the story. How bloggers, independent voices, everyday people were labeled liars simply because the big networks refused to acknowledge what was happening. That wasn't ignorance. That was suppression. And older audiences understand suppression. We've seen it in politics. We've seen it in churches. We've seen it in corporations. We've seen it in families. Power protects itself until it can't anymore. And when Diddy's homes were finally raided, suddenly the tone changed. Suddenly the story mattered. Suddenly the cameras turned on. Not because the truth had changed, but because his power had. That's the moment when the gatekeepers let go. Not out of morality, but out of safety. Because once a powerful man becomes a liability, loyalty evaporates. And Charlemagne saying what he said wasn't bravery in isolation. It was timing. It was recognizing that the spell had broken. Because once the public stops clapping, everyone hears it. That's why his words mattered. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't talking about healing. He wasn't suggesting redemption. He was saying something far more serious. We should not rush to put powerful men back in front of microphones when they have not confronted what they've done. And that statement, especially coming from someone who understands media, was a quiet indictment. Because it admitted what many already knew. Platforming without accountability is participation. And for those of us who've watched generations repeat the same mistakes, we understand that letting someone back in without change doesn't just hurt the victims. It teaches the next generation that power erases consequences. That's why this matters beyond one man. This is about what kind of culture we leave behind. And while Diddy may still have supporters online, people shouting into the void, defending him with desperation, it's clear those are not the rooms he wants to be in. Because Diddy doesn't want survival. He wants status. He wants exclusivity. He wants admiration from equals. He wants validation from power. And that's the cruel irony. The people defending him now? He would never sit with them. He would never break bread with them. He would never invite them into his world. Because the same man who once ruled rooms believes himself above the very people clinging to him. And that's why this fall feels so complete. Because the silence on that stage wasn't just rejection from the public. It was rejection from the world he wanted to return to. And the next part of this story, what comes next, won't be about music or branding or even law. It will be about whether accountability can exist without ego. And history tells us that's a very hard road. There is something that happens when a man has been powerful for too long. He begins to confuse applause with approval, access with affection, silence with loyalty. And that confusion is dangerous. Because when the applause stops, when the access dries up, when the silence finally breaks, he doesn't know how to stand without it. That's where Diddy is now. Not at the beginning of his fall, but at the point where denial becomes the last refuge. And people who have lived long lives recognize this pattern immediately. We've seen it in business tycoons. We've seen it in politicians. We've seen it in religious leaders who preached righteousness while hiding rot behind the pulpit. The fall always looks the same. First, there is disbelief. Then there is anger. Then there is performance. Performance is where things get theatrical. Because when accountability feels impossible, image becomes the substitute. That's why you start seeing the pivot coming, the soft lighting, the religious language, the public displays of growth, the carefully staged moments meant to signal rebirth without repentance. We've all seen this movie before. A powerful man in trouble suddenly finds God, on camera. Suddenly speaks about forgiveness, without apology. Suddenly talks about healing, without acknowledging harm. It's not faith. It's strategy. And for older audiences especially, this is familiar territory. We were raised in communities where faith meant something, where repentance wasn't performative, where apology didn't come with excuses. Back then, redemption required humility. Today, it requires optics. But optics don't heal wounds. And they don't erase memory. That's why the idea of a Diddy comeback feels hollow. Not because people don't believe in forgiveness, but because forgiveness requires truth. And truth has not been spoken. What Charlemagne understood, and what many in the industry now understand privately, is that you cannot rehabilitate a brand when the person behind it refuses to confront who they are. Diddy doesn't want reflection. He wants restoration. And there is a difference. Reflection asks, who did I hurt? Restoration asks, how do I get back what I lost? One is about others. The other is about self. And that's the heart of the problem. The rooms Diddy wants back into are not rooms of struggle. They are rooms of privilege, of power, of influence, of exclusivity. He doesn't want the grassroots support shouting online. He wants respect from elites. He wants to be in the south of France, not scrolling through comments. He wants wealth, not defense. He wants admiration, not debate. And that's why this moment on stage mattered so deeply. Because it showed him something he may not have been prepared to see. That even in spaces built by his legacy, belief has evaporated. That even among people who once benefited from his name, there is distance now. That even when the music plays, the spirit is gone. That's not cancellation. That's consequence. And there's another truth older audiences understand. Legacy isn't what you build when things are good. It's what survives when they're not. Right now, what's surviving isn't music. It isn't fashion. It isn't innovation. It's questions. It's stories. It's silence. And silence, when it spreads, becomes judgment. This is why the idea of a comeback feels so fragile. Not because it's impossible, but because it would require something this man has never demonstrated publicly. Surrender. Not to the law. Not to public opinion. But to truth. And that kind of surrender is rare among people who've spent their entire lives controlling narratives. Control becomes identity. And when identity is threatened, people cling to illusion. That's why the supporters he has now, loud, defensive, combative, are not signs of strength. They are signs of isolation. Because real power doesn't need defending. Real respect doesn't need chanting. It shows up naturally. And when it doesn't show up at all, that tells you everything. This isn't about piling on. It isn't about spectacle. It's about watching a man face the moment where all the strategies stop working. And history teaches us something very sobering. Men who refuse accountability don't disappear quietly. They linger. They perform. They deny. Until the world moves on without them. And that may be the hardest punishment of all. There comes a season in every life when excuses stop working. Not because people are cruel, but because they are tired. Tired of explanations. Tired of watching harm get renamed as misunderstanding. Tired of seeing powerful men escape the consequences that ordinary people would never survive. That season has arrived. And it has arrived not with anger, not with mobs, not with outrage, but with something far more final. Indifference. For those who have lived long enough to see cycles repeat, indifference is not confusion. It is judgment without drama. It is the quiet decision to withdraw belief. That moment on that stage, where a name once commanded obedience and received nothing in return, was not a failure of performance. It was the public closing a door. Because here is a truth older generations understand deeply. Respect is not demanded. It is remembered, and memory has a long reach. Diddy's story is no longer being written by lawyers, publicists, or loyal supporters online. It is being written by the absence of trust, by rooms that no longer open, by people who no longer rush to defend. That kind of loss cannot be repaired with time. Only truth repairs truth. What stands in the way is not forgiveness, it is pride. Pride convinces a man that image can substitute for repentance. That silence will pass. That people will forget. That another reinvention will work the way it always has. But reinvention only works when the public still wants to believe. And belief is gone. This is the part of the story where many powerful men reach for faith, not as transformation, but as shelter. They borrow the language of grace without accepting the cost of accountability. They ask to be washed clean without ever admitting where the stain came from. Older audiences recognize this immediately. We were raised to understand that faith is not a costume. It is not a shield. It is not something you put on when the world turns against you. Real faith begins when there is nothing left to hide behind. And hiding has been the pattern here. For years, people protected what they benefited from. They told themselves silence was neutrality. That staying quiet was professionalism. That asking questions was disloyal. But silence, when prolonged, becomes complicity. And that is why this moment feels heavier than scandal. It feels like exposure, because the mask didn't fall all at once. It slipped slowly, piece by piece, lawsuit by lawsuit, story by story, until the image could no longer carry the weight of what was beneath it. Now the truth sits in the open. And the hardest part for someone like Diddy is not public criticism. It is irrelevance. It is knowing that the rooms he once ruled no longer need him. That the culture he once shaped has moved forward without waiting for him to catch up. That is a grief few talk about. The grief of becoming unnecessary. Supporters shouting online cannot replace peers turning away. Defenders in comment sections cannot recreate invitations that no longer come. And that is why the road forward, if there is one, is so narrow. Because it requires surrender without guarantee. It requires accountability without applause. It requires apology without expectation of forgiveness. And history tells us that very few men who spent their lives at the top are willing to walk that road. Not because it is unfair, but because it is humbling. At this stage, there is no clever pivot left. No narrative left to manage. No performance left to stage that will change what people already feel. What remains is a choice. To confront the truth fully, knowing it may cost everything. Or to cling to the illusion of who you were, even as the world moves on. That silence on that stage was not mockery. It was the sound of a chapter closing. And chapters do not reopen just because someone wants them to. They reopen only when the story changes. And change, real change, has never come from power. It comes from accountability. Whether that accountability arrives willingly or is forced by time is the final unanswered truth. But one thing is certain. The world has already spoken. And it spoke without raising its voice.